In the summer of 1871, inside a parish courthouse situated along the lower Mississippi, a young seamstress named Delphine Boissou was expected to appear on the witness stand at 7 in the morning. She never showed up. The bailiff discovered her boarding room door bolted from the inside, her evening meal left untouched and cold on the table, her shoes arranged neatly at the bedside, and a single lamp still burning, with just enough oil remaining to indicate it, had been lit well past midnight. What the bailiff failed to record, and what the parish register would later leave out for nearly 6 decades, was that 3 other individuals who had also been set to testify that same week were unaccounted for by Friday. Furthermore, the riverbank below the courthouse had been quietly dragged twice before the judge declared the trial adjourned without a set date for resumption. According to the surviving records, she is described as being 24 years old, unmarried, fluent in both French and English, and in possession of a ledger that no one in authority ever admitted to having examined. That ledger, as claimed by the sole person who asserted they had held it, contained the names of 17 men in the parish, along with the amounts each had paid to ensure that particular things and specific individuals disappeared. Before we proceed with the narrative of Delphine Boissou and the courthouse at Pointe Coupee, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Activate the bell so you won't miss what follows. And leave a comment telling me the state or city you are currently listening from. Knowing your location makes these stories feel less like disembodied voices in the darkness and more like a dialogue between strangers who have agreed, for a brief time, not to turn away. Now, draw closer, because what we are about to step into is not a ghost story. It is a documentation of what men will do when they think no one is recording anything, and what one woman did when she realized, seated by an oil lamp in a locked room, that the sole weapon left to her was the manner in which she would choose to be remembered. To grasp what transpired with Delphine, you must first comprehend the place that absorbed her. Pointe Coupee was never a large settlement, even during its peak. It was situated on a horseshoe bend of the Mississippi, about 40 miles downriver from Baton Rouge, where the bluffs transitioned into cypress flats, and the August air was so dense that locals claimed you could chew it between your teeth. The town had been established in the 1760s by French colonists who had drifted south from the Illinois Territory. By 1871, its population was a complex mix of old Creole families, formerly enslaved individuals who had remained on the plantations as laborers, Cajun farmers from the interior, Irish dockworkers who had arrived from New Orleans after the Civil War, and a few northern agents representing cotton factors in Natchez and Memphis. The parish courthouse stood atop a low rise, constructed from locally fired yellow brick that had already begun to soften at the corners. Its clock tower was the tallest structure for a day's ride in every direction. When the clock chimed on quiet nights, the sound could be heard from the opposite bank of the river. A slow, iron note that traveled across the water and into the cypress groves, where it seemed to listeners in the riverfront taverns to have originated from somewhere beneath the earth, rather than above it. This was a land of levees and lantern, lit wharves, of sugarcane rotting sweetly in the fields after harvest, of mosquitoes that rose from the swamps in clouds so dense they left welts on horses. The roads leading in from the interior were little more than ruts that turned to black mud in the rain and to fine gray dust in the summer. That dust settled on everything. On the shoulders of men's coats, on the windowsills of the boarding houses, on the linen that washerwomen hung out to dry behind the laundries on the south end of town. It was also a region in the midst of a long and bitter realignment, because the war had ended only 6 years earlier. and the men who had once governed Pointe Coupee were gradually learning, with considerable resentment, that governance was no longer exclusively theirs. The parish housed a federal garrison of 12 soldiers billeted in a requisitioned warehouse near the steamer landing. It had a Republican sheriff imposed from Baton Rouge, a heavy, set man with a limp from Shiloh, whom none of the old families would invite to dinner. It had 3 newspapers, 2 of which printed in the carefully coded language of the Reconstruction press, reminders of what had been and suggestions of what might return. Beneath all of that, it had a quieter rearrangement, which was the rearrangement of money. The cotton trade was shifting. The sugar economy had been devastated, and the old fortunes were being supplanted by newer ones built on methods that the old fortunes had also used, but that the old fortunes had never been required to record in 2 distinct sets of books. Delphine herself was not a native of the parish. She had arrived in 1867 from a small settlement further south in the Bayou country, brought in by an aunt who operated a boarding house on Rue St. Louis, 2 blocks from the courthouse square. The aunt, a widow named Celeste Arsenault, rented rooms almost exclusively to young women who worked in the shops and laundries of the town, and she managed her house with the quiet severity of a convent. The parlor clock was not allowed to run slow. The front door was bolted at 9 o'clock. No mail callers were permitted past the front hallway, and every young woman staying in the house understood, without ever being explicitly told, that the preservation of a boarding house of respectable girls in Pointe Coupee in the year 1871 depended on the preservation of appearances. In Celeste's view, appearances were not the opposite of truth, but its outer armor. Delphine was slender, with the dark hair of her mother's people, and the pale gray eyes of a Norman grandfather she had never met. She had inherited from him a habit of listening with her eyes half lowered, which people sometimes misinterpreted as shyness, but which was, in fact, acute attention. She took in sewing work, and by the spring of 1871, she had cultivated a clientele that included the wives of cotton factors, the daughters of the parish judge, and 2 prominent women from the Catholic Charity Society. Her hands were quick, and her mouth was quiet. In a town where almost everyone believed they knew everyone else's business, she was regarded as someone who kept her own counsel. She was also, by every account, devout in a gentle and unobtrusive way, attending 6 o'clock Mass on Sunday mornings at the small brick church behind the courthouse and bringing communion to an elderly neighbor who could no longer walk. She had one suitor, a bookkeeper at the cotton warehouse named Etienne Pelletier, who had asked her twice to marry him and been gently refused both times, though she continued to walk with him along the levee on Sunday afternoons. Pelletier was a patient man. He was 26, with a soft brown beard and eyes that squinted from too many years over ledgers. He had told a friend at the warehouse in the winter of 1870 that he intended to keep asking Delphine once a year for as long as it took, because he believed that a woman who said no twice was not a woman who meant never, but merely a woman who meant not yet. There is nothing else in the surviving descriptions of Delphine that would have singled her out for attention. She was, in almost every visible sense, an ordinary young woman of her class and station, which was, perhaps, exactly the reason someone chose her to keep the ledger. The ledger itself did not belong to Delphine. It belonged, or had belonged, to a man named Marius Robichaux, a cotton broker of middling reputation and considerable private wealth, who had died in February of 1871 under circumstances that the parish physician listed as sudden apoplexy, and that several of the man's household servants later described privately as something nearer to a violent and panicked poisoning. Robichaux had kept 2 sets of books for most of his adult life. One tracked his official business, bales purchased, warehousing fees, shipments to New Orleans, notes owed to the Baton Rouge banks. The other tracked a different kind of commerce, one that had begun modestly during the war, when a number of men in the parish had discovered that displaced persons, lost property, and disputed titles created opportunities for those willing to handle certain matters without the complication of paperwork. By the time Robichaux died, the second ledger had grown to 183 pages, and according to the single witness who ever described its contents in any detail, it named 17 men in Pointe Coupee who had purchased services that ranged from the intimidation of rival witnesses to the discreet disposal of documents to the removal of persons who had become inconvenient to the business interests of the parish elite. The first ledger was discovered on Robichaux's desk the morning after his death. The second ledger was not. His widow, a small and frightened woman named Madeleine, found it 3 weeks later wrapped in oilcloth, beneath a loose floorboard in her late husband's study. After sitting with it for 2 nights, she brought it in a sewing basket to the boarding house of Celeste Arsenault, who was her cousin. She came at dusk in a plain black shawl and sat in Celeste's kitchen for nearly an hour without speaking, drinking cup after cup of coffee that had gone cold in the cup. When at last she pushed the sewing basket across the table, she said only that she could no longer sleep with the thing in her house, that Celeste would understand when she opened it, and that she hoped Celeste would forgive her for bringing it because there was no one else in the parish she trusted with a secret that heavy. Celeste, by her own later account, did not open the basket until Madeleine had left. When she did, she stood for a long time at her kitchen table, holding the oilcloth package in her hands, reading the first 3 pages by the light of a single candle. Then she wrapped it up again, climbed the stairs to the top floor, and hid it in the cedar-lined linen chest at the foot of Delphine's bed. Because Delphine's room was the only room in the house with a working bolt on the door, and because Celeste had understood in that moment that she was not strong enough to carry the thing alone, and that the one person in her house who might be strong enough was the one she most wished to protect. She told no one, not even Delphine, what was inside, or so Celeste later claimed. The events that brought Delphine to the witness stand began in April when a laborer named Isaac Green was found dead at the foot of the levee. A man of perhaps 40 who had worked as a teamster for one of the old sugar plantations, and who had, in the preceding months, begun filing claims for wages unpaid since before emancipation. He had been a quiet man by all accounts, a widower, a Methodist, a father of 3 grown daughters, and he had come to the federal agent's office in Baton Rouge twice that winter carrying carefully written statements he had dictated to a schoolteacher in exchange for a week's labor on her woodpile. The parish authorities ruled his death a drowning. They noted in the brief report, filed by the deputy coroner, that his pockets had been empty, that his boots had been missing, and that the back of his skull showed the kind of injury consistent. The coroner wrote, with a fall against rocks in shallow water. 2 of his co-workers, both black freedmen named Solomon Reed and Marcus Freeman, came forward within a week to say that Green had been beaten behind the cotton warehouse on the night of his death and thrown into the river afterward, and that they had seen 3 white men standing over him in the lantern light, one of whom had been the warehouse foreman, a man named Jonas Perrin, whose family had been listed in the published obituary of Marius Robichaux as among the late broker's closest business associates. Under ordinary circumstances in the parish, such a claim would have produced no indictment and no investigation. The sheriff would have listened or not. The deputy coroner would have filed the report or amended it. Life would have resumed. But 1871 was not an ordinary year. A federal circuit judge named Horace Tremont had been appointed to oversee civil rights enforcement in the lower Mississippi districts, and Tremont was not from Louisiana. He was a Vermonter, a former Union colonel, a man in his 50s with a short gray beard and a trick knee from a musket ball at Spotsylvania. And he believed with the narrow and unwavering conviction of a New England Congregationalist that the Reconstruction of the South depended on the willingness of federal courts to convict white men for crimes they had previously committed without consequence. Tremont did not shout. He did not make speeches. He did not give interviews to the newspapers. He simply read and wrote and issued subpoenas with a steady, methodical patience that his clerks said reminded them of a man carving a channel into stone with a penknife. Tremont scheduled a grand jury for the first week of July and subpoenaed not only the 2 witnesses who had come forward, but any person in the parish known to have had dealings with Marius Robichaux, on the theory that Robichaux's second ledger, rumors of which had reached Baton Rouge, might contain information relevant to a pattern of organized violence against freedmen in the cotton trade. Delphine Boissou's name appeared on the subpoena list because Celeste Arsenault's name had been on the list first, and because when the federal marshal knocked on the boarding house door, in the hot drizzle of a June afternoon, Celeste, terrified and ill with a fever that had begun the night before, pointed down the hallway and said that her niece was the one who could speak to what was kept in the linen chest. That is how, in the last week of June 1871, a 24-year-old seamstress with no living parents and no surviving brothers came to be the one person in Pointe Coupee who could put a ledger on the record and name one by one the men who had paid Marius Robichaux to make things and people disappear. She had read it by then. She had read it against her aunt's implicit wishes. Sitting by the oil lamp in her room, with the door bolted and the shutters closed, listening to the small noises of the house settling around her. The creak of the staircase, the soft tick of the parlor clock 2 floors below, the occasional bark of a dog from the levee road. She had read all 183 pages in 7 nights. On the first night, she had read only the opening pages, and had set it down and gone to bed and lain awake until dawn. On the second night, she had read for 3 hours and had gone downstairs at midnight to make herself tea. Celeste, who had not been sleeping either, came to the kitchen door and looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Neither of them said anything. Delphine carried her tea back upstairs. Celeste returned to her bedroom. On the third night, Delphine had begun to keep notes in a small cloth-bound book kept at the bottom of her sewing basket, written in a personal shorthand that combined French abbreviations with a cipher of her own invention, that substituted letters of the alphabet by the numerical position of saints' days in the liturgical calendar. By the 5th night, she had begun to recognize patterns. By the 6th, she had begun to recognize names. When she closed it on the 7th night, she understood, with the clarity of a person who had grown up in a country where certain lessons were taught young, that she was now the most dangerous woman in the parish, and that the only thing protecting her was the fact that most of the 17 men did not yet know she existed. She did not sleep at all that 7th night. She sat in the wooden chair by the window, with the shutters closed and the lamp guttering, watching the faint seam of gray that slowly grew between the slats of the shutters as dawn came up over the river. She thought about her mother, who had died when she was 11 of the fever that swept through the bayou in the autumn of 1858, who had taught her to sew by candlelight, and who on the last night of her life had held Delphine's hand and told her that the one thing no one could ever take from her was the careful attention of her own mind. She thought about her father, who had died at Shiloh, whose face she could no longer remember clearly, but whose voice she could still summon in moments of quiet. A slow, deep voice that had always spoken French at home and English only in the market. She thought about the walks along the levee with Etienne Pelletier, about the 6 o'clock mass at the small brick church, and about the elderly neighbor to whom she brought communion. And she understood that none of those things would protect her, and that none of the men named in the ledger would hesitate, because the men named in the ledger had already demonstrated repeatedly that hesitation was not among their habits. She understood something else, which took her by surprise. She was not afraid. She was something else, something colder and quieter than fear. In the days that followed, she would come to recognize it as the particular stillness of a person who has made a decision before she knows she has made it. The deposition was scheduled for the morning of July the 5th. The marshal came for her at dawn in a light summer rain, the kind of rain that in Louisiana smells of cypress bark and iron. He found the door of her room locked from the inside. Celeste unlocked it with her own key, a thin brass key that had hung on a black ribbon around her neck. For as long as anyone could remember, the two of them stood in the doorway and looked at what the room contained and did not contain. The bed had been slept in, or at least disturbed. The coverlet was pulled back at the corner. The pillow bore the shallow cup of a head that had lain there for at least an hour. The supper on the small pine table was cold but untouched, a plate of rice and red beans, with a single piece of bread broken in half, and a pewter cup of water beside it, still full. Her shoes, the black leather walking boots she wore to Mass, were placed side by side at the foot of the bed, as though she had meant to put them on in the morning, and had at some point in the night decided not to. The oil lamp on the writing desk still had a thin film of smoke on its chimney, which meant it had burned long past the hour at which she was known to retire. Her second best dress, the green one she had pressed the afternoon before to wear to the courthouse, was hanging on the back of the door, still pressed. The sleeves smoothed, the collar sharp, a small piece of lavender tucked into the breast pocket. Her Bible was open on the dresser, face down to the Book of Judith. On the desk, in the center of the blotter, was a single sheet of paper on which she had written, in her careful schoolmistress hand, the phrase, "She would not take another name," followed by 3 initials that nobody in the room recognized, and nothing else. The linen chest at the foot of the bed was open. The ledger was gone, and so was Delphine. No window was broken. No floorboard was disturbed. The shutters were locked from the inside, with a small iron pin dropped through the latch, as was done every night before she went to bed. The bolt on the door had been thrown from the inside. And the bolt on that door, as anyone who had ever tried to enter knew, was stiff with age and had a particular sound, when thrown, that could be heard from 2 rooms away. The only way out of that room, if she had left it alive, was through a door she could not have locked behind her. And yet the room was empty. The marshal, whose name was Henry Callahan, and who had fought with the Irish Brigade at Antietam, stood in the doorway for nearly a full minute before he said anything. He was a tall man, gaunt in the way that older Irishmen become gaunt, with a long graying beard, and eyes the color of wet slate. He had a scar that began at the hairline above his left eye and ran down into the beard, and he had a habit, when thinking, of rubbing the scar with the side of his thumb. He rubbed it now. When he finally spoke, He addressed Celeste in a low voice, asking whether she was certain the niece had been in the room when she retired for the night. Celeste said she was certain. Her voice, she said afterward, felt to her as though it were coming from the next room. She said she had brought Delphine a cup of chicory coffee at 9 o'clock, and that they had spoken for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Delphine had been calm but pale, and had said she would sleep well because she had made her peace with God and with the testimony she was going to give. Celeste said she had heard her niece bolt the door after her, because the bolt on that door was stiff and had a particular sound when thrown. She said she had gone to bed herself just after 10, that the house had been quiet all night, and that she had not heard a single footstep on the stairs. Callahan walked around the room twice. He looked under the bed. He tested the shutters. He stood on a chair and examined the ceiling. He lifted the Bible on the dresser, looked beneath it, and then set it back down exactly as he had found it, face down on the Book of Judith. Then he asked Celeste to leave the room and stood alone in it for a long time. Celeste, standing in the hallway, heard him do two things: open the linen chest and close it again, and murmur very softly something in Irish. A word she did not understand, a word she later believed was a prayer. When he came out, his face was the color of tallow, and he said only that this was no longer a matter for the marshal's office. It was a matter for Judge Tremont. That night, 2 other witnesses on Tremont's list disappeared. Marcus Freeman, the freedman who had worked beside Isaac Green on the plantation, and who had come forward to describe the beating behind the warehouse, was last seen at a small tavern on the riverfront at 10:30, walking out into the rain with a friend who said he saw Freeman turn north along the levee path, and then lost sight of him in the dark. Freeman did not arrive home. His wife, a woman named Cora, waited all night with a lantern in the window. At first light, she went out along the path with a cousin, calling his name. They found nothing but the soft black mud and the deep silence of the cypress. By mid-morning, 3 more men had joined the search. By noon, one of Freeman's shoes was found at the edge of the river, half sunk in the mud with the laces still tied. No body was ever recovered. The other witness, a white shopkeeper named Edward Lacombe, who had done business with Robichaux and had been prepared to testify about certain payments, recorded in the first ledger, that had been intended to conceal the second, simply failed to open his store on the morning of the 6th. His clerk, a boy of 14 named Thomas, who had worked there for 2 years, found the store locked, the till untouched, and a half-drunk cup of tea on the counter behind the ribbon rack. Lacombe's hat and coat were on their hook. His horse was still in the stable. The rear door of the shop was bolted from the inside, just as Delphine's had been. The clerk, standing in that small back room in the gray morning light, said afterward that he had the sudden and unshakable feeling that he was standing in a place where someone had been only a few minutes before, and that whoever had taken them had been careful and patient and unhurried. By Friday, Judge Tremont had lost 3 of his 4 witnesses. By Saturday, the grand jury had been dismissed. By the following Tuesday, the second ledger, which had been the reason for the entire proceeding, was officially considered by the parish authorities to have never existed at all. If this story is holding you, now is the moment to press like. It tells me you want the channel to keep digging into these records, and it pushes these stories toward other people who might actually want to hear them. Share it with someone who loves dark history. And if you have not already, subscribe and turn on the bell. There is more of Pointe Coupee to come, and I want you with me when we get to it. Decades later, in the years after the First World War, A young woman named Antoinette Duval came to Pointe Coupee from New Orleans to settle the estate of an aunt who had died without direct heirs. The aunt had been a daughter of Celeste Arsenault, and the boarding house on Rue St. Louis had passed to her, and from her in 1919 to Antoinette. The house had been shuttered for 2 years by then. The rooms were dusty. The kitchen smelled faintly of mice and of the coffee grounds left in a tin on a shelf for a decade. Antoinette was 26 years old, a slender woman with her grandmother's pale gray eyes and her mother's dark hair, trained as a schoolteacher, engaged to a printer she had met at a lecture on the suffrage movement in Chicago. She had come south for a month to sort through what remained. Most of the house was sold or distributed within the first 3 weeks. But in the attic, in a locked tin trunk that had not been opened in at least 40 years, she found a bundle of papers tied with black ribbon. Among those papers was a letter sealed in wax, addressed in a careful schoolmistress hand to a person who did not exist. The envelope read simply, "To the one who asks." Antoinette sat on the attic floor, in the dusty amber light coming in through the small round window, turning the envelope over in her hands for nearly 5 minutes before she opened it. The letter was dated the 3rd of July, 1871, 2 days before Delphine's disappearance, and it had been written in French, running to nearly 7 pages. It began with an account of how the ledger had come into the boarding house, how Delphine had been told to keep it in her linen chest, and how she had, against her aunt's explicit instructions, read it. It described what she had read. It named 6 of the 17 men and set out, in the plain and methodical prose of a woman trained to keep household accounts, what each of them had paid Marius Robichaux for, and when, and how much. It described the death of a dock worker in 1866, whose body had been weighted and sunk in the river off the old sugar wharf, naming the 2 men who had paid $4.42 for the disposal, the man who had received the payment, and the exact night on which the deed had been done. It described the forced removal of a freedman family in 1868, whose claim to land near the bayou had been inconveniently supported by a written deed, the arson of the small cabin in which that family had lived, the 3 men who had purchased the arson, the 2 men who had carried the lanterns, and the 4-year-old child who had died of smoke inhalation in a back room. It described the disappearance of a young midwife in 1869, whose only crime had been to tell 3 pregnant women that the doctor they had been sent was a drunk who had killed 2 patients, and the method by which that midwife had been silenced: a staged elopement, a forged letter to her family, and a shallow grave in a cane field 12 miles north of town. Each of these accounts was set down without elaboration or outrage, as though Delphine understood that her only protection against being dismissed as hysterical was to write like a clerk. Then, near the end, the tone shifted. The last 2 pages were something else. They described a visit she had received on the evening of the 1st of July, 4 days before her deposition. A man had come to the boarding house at dusk. He had not given his name, but Celeste had shown him up to the parlor, and Delphine had been summoned. The man was not a stranger. She recognized him as the eldest son of one of the men named in the ledger, a planter from the north end of the parish, whose family had lost most of its land in the war and was rebuilding its fortune through the cotton trade. He was perhaps 35 years old, well dressed in a dark gray frock coat of a cut that had arrived from New Orleans that spring, quiet in his manner, clean, shaven with hands that showed no labor, and a gold ring on his smallest finger. He had, Delphine wrote, the particular calm of a man who had made a decision he did not expect to be disputed. He sat across from her in the small parlor, in the ladder, back chair by the fireplace. Celeste brought coffee and then, at a glance from the man, withdrew. He waited until the door of the parlor had closed behind her before speaking. He told her he understood she had been subpoenaed, that she was in possession of certain papers, and that he had come to propose a transaction. He said he could see, from the quality of her sewing and the modesty of her circumstances, that she was a woman of limited means and considerable intelligence, and that such a combination was rarely rewarded in the world as it presently existed. He said he was authorized by persons he did not name to offer her 2,000 zals and in gold and passage to any city she chose, east or west, along with a letter of introduction to respectable families in that city who would receive her as a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances. He named the families, one of which was the Boston family of a woman for whom Delphine had, 4 months earlier, made a wedding gown. He said that in exchange, she was to hand over the ledger, withdraw from her testimony on grounds of conscience, and leave the parish within 48 hours. He said the alternative was one she would not enjoy, though he phrased it with great delicacy. He said the parish had, he believed, already demonstrated what could happen to persons who insisted on carrying burdens that did not belong to them. He paused and looked at her with something like regret, saying he wanted her to understand that the offer was a kindness, and that it was the last kindness that would be offered. Then he waited. She wrote that he waited with a patience she found more frightening than any shouting could have been, because he was not a hot-tempered man, nor a cruel man in the way a beast is cruel. He was simply a man prepared to destroy her with the same administrative efficiency with which he would have foreclosed on a farm. Delphine wrote that she had looked at him for a long time and felt, for the first time in her adult life, the full weight of what it meant to be a woman in a place like Pointe Coupee in a year like 1871. Then she wrote that she had understood in that moment that the 17 men in the ledger were not a conspiracy so much as a system older than any of them, that would survive all of them, and that whether she took the gold and fled, or handed over the ledger and stayed, the system would not be dismantled by her testimony or her silence. She wrote that she had thought, briefly, and with a kind of distant amusement, about how she would describe the moment to Etienne Pelletier, if she could ever describe it to anyone. And she had understood she could not. The inability to tell him was itself a kind of wound. A small, cold wound she could not yet name. Then she wrote something that changed the entire meaning of this case. She had asked the man a single question. She asked who had sent him. He smiled very slightly and said no one had sent him. He had come on his own because the other 16 were prepared to take measures he considered distasteful, and he wished to spare her and himself that distastefulness. He said the others would come on the night of the 4th, if she had not gone by then, and what they would do, she would not survive. Delphine thanked him for the warning, asked him to leave, and he left. She wrote that she had sat in the parlor alone for nearly an hour afterward and realized, with a peculiar and almost weightless calm, that she had been given not a choice between life and death, but between 2 different kinds of disappearance. To take the gold was to disappear as a person who had once mattered. To stay was to disappear as a body. To do the third thing, the thing she had begun to plan, as she sat alone in the parlor, while the clock in the tower struck 11, was to disappear as something else entirely. The letter ended there, with a signature and a date, and a note that she had written it in case the worst should come to pass, and someone, someday, should want to know what she had chosen and why. When Antoinette Duval read the letter in 1919, she did not immediately tell anyone. She was 26 years old, had grown up in New Orleans, hearing rumors of a cousin, who had vanished in the years after the war. But her mother had always refused to speak of it, and the rumors had never included names. Antoinette sat with the letter for 3 days, reading it a second and third time. On the fourth morning, she walked down to the parish courthouse, carrying the letter in her handbag, and asked to see the records of the grand jury called in July of 1871. The clerk, a young man with oiled hair and a celluloid collar, told her politely that no such grand jury had ever convened. Antoinette produced a printed reference to it from a published memoir of Judge Horace Tremont, who had died in Vermont in 1903. The clerk excused himself for nearly half an hour. When he returned, he was accompanied by a man who introduced himself as the parish attorney. A thin and careful person in his 60s, whose family name Antoinette recognized. With a jolt she hoped did not show in her face from the 6 names in her cousin's letter. The parish attorney was courteous. He invited her into his office, offered her coffee, and listened to her describe the letter without asking to see it. He did not write anything down. Then he told her, in the gentle and regretful tone of a man explaining that a roof cannot be repaired because the timbers are rotten through, that the documents she was looking for had been destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1884, that the memoir she cited was known to contain inaccuracies, and that the family name of the young woman she was inquiring about did not appear in any parish record he could locate. He suggested, with the same gentleness, that perhaps her cousin had run away with a man and started a new life elsewhere, as young women sometimes did, and that it would be a kindness to the family's memory to let the matter rest. He walked her to the door, shook her hand. His hand dry and cool, the hand of a man who had never done physical labor in his life. And on the street outside, in the bright October light, Antoinette understood 2 things at once. The first was that the parish attorney had known the name of her cousin before she had spoken it. The second was that the letter in her handbag was now the most dangerous object in Pointe Coupee, just as the ledger had been 48 years before, and that the patience that had waited for Delphine in a darkened parlor in 1871 was, in its slow and institutional way, still waiting. She walked back to the boarding house by a different route than the one she had taken in the morning. She did not stop at the hotel, where she had left her midday meal on the table. She did not speak to anyone she passed. She packed her trunk that afternoon and left on the first train the following morning. She did not set foot in Louisiana again for the rest of her life. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Pointe Coupee turns out to be something stranger and more patient than we had reason to expect. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what actually happened in that room on Rue St. Louis on the night of the 4th of July, 1871. Because we are not done yet. Antoinette took the letter with her to New Orleans, and then from New Orleans to Chicago, where she married the printer in 1922 and raised 2 daughters. The letter sat for another 40 years in a safe deposit box at a bank on Dearborn Street. She told her husband about it once, in 1931, on a winter evening, when snow was piling against the kitchen window and the radio was playing a program about the Scopes trial. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he said he thought the letter belonged to history, and that the right thing was probably to give it someday to a historian who knew what to do with it. But the right historian, they agreed, did not yet exist, the country was not ready, and the safe deposit box would wait. It was her younger daughter, a woman named Rose, who finally brought it to the attention of a historian in 1963. After Rose read an article in a national magazine about the records of the federal Reconstruction courts in Louisiana and the peculiar number of witnesses who had never lived to testify, a young assistant professor at Tulane named James Hodges flew to Chicago within a week. He was 31 years old, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, the son of a Methodist minister, and he had been looking for a case like this for 3 years. Without knowing it was the case he was looking for. He read the letter twice in Rose's kitchen with a cup of coffee in front of him that went cold. Then he asked her very carefully whether the family had kept any other papers from the aunt's estate. Rose said there was a trunk in the basement that nobody had opened in her lifetime. She and Hodges went down the basement stairs together and pried the trunk open with a screwdriver. Inside, beneath 3 folded quilts and a bundle of tax receipts from the 1890s, they found the second ledger of Marius Robichaux. It was exactly as Delphine had described it: 183 pages, 17 names, dates, sums, and descriptions in the brisk commercial shorthand of a cotton broker of what had been purchased and on whose behalf. Hodges sat on the basement floor and read it for 2 hours without speaking. The furnace clicked on and off. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere outside. At one point, Rose brought down a fresh pot of coffee and set it on a wooden crate beside him, and he did not look up. When he finally looked up, he said in a voice that Rose later remembered as almost apologetic that the names in the ledger belonged to families still prominent in Louisiana, and that publication of the ledger would not result in any prosecutions, because every man named in it had been dead for half a century. What they were holding was not evidence but history, and history in a country as young and as reluctant as the United States was sometimes the only justice the dead ever got. But here is where the story turns, and where the question I want to leave you with becomes unavoidable. What Hodges published in 1964 in a small academic monograph that sold fewer than 300 copies and was never reprinted was not only the ledger and the letter, but also the account of what the ledger revealed about the night of the 4th of July 1871 in the room on Rue St. Louis. The ledger contained, as it turned out, one final entry. It had been written in a hand that was not Robichaux's, because Robichaux had been dead for 5 months, but in a hand that matched exactly the hand of an entry Robichaux had made 3 years earlier on behalf of a client who had signed his own name in a contract later filed with the parish records. The final entry was dated the 2nd of July 1871, 3 days before Delphine was scheduled to testify. It read, in translation from the broker's commercial French, Commission 17 subscribers pro rata for final arrangement of the matter of the Rue St. Louis, to be completed on the night of the 4th. Some collected and held in escrow pending confirmation. The entry did not name the person who had written it, but Hodges, reading it in Rose's basement in 1963, had understood immediately who had written it. There was only one person in the parish apart from Robichaux who had known every subscriber by name and known the exact amount each would be assessed for a pro rata commission. That person had been the senior clerk of the cotton warehouse, a bookkeeper with a soft brown beard and eyes that squinted from too many years over ledgers, who had walked down the levee with Delphine on Sunday afternoons, who had asked her twice to marry him, and who had been, from the beginning, the man the 17 had sent to watch her. The account was this. Delphine had made a plan in the hour after the young planter left her parlor on the evening of the 1st of July. But the plan had not begun that night. It had begun 2 weeks earlier, when she first began reading the ledger and recognized, on the 4th page, the distinctive handwriting of the warehouse clerk, Etienne Pelletier, who had made 3 fair copy transcriptions in the book and signed them with the small flourished P. he used on the envelopes of the letters he wrote to her. She had sat by the oil lamp in her room for a long time that night, holding the ledger and looking at the P. She understood, in the slow way, that a person understands something she has already half understood for months. That the patient suitor who had asked her twice to marry him and had been content to wait was not waiting for her love. He was waiting for her testimony. He had been placed beside her carefully and at leisure by men who had foreseen, even before Robichaux's death, that the ledger would one day need to be retrieved from whoever came to hold it, and that the cleanest way to retrieve it was through the hands of a trusted fiancé. She wrote that she had continued to walk with him on Sunday afternoons for 2 more weeks. Because she was not certain whether she was right, because she wanted to be certain. She wrote that on the last Sunday, the 25th of June, she had tested him casually by asking whether he had ever done business with a certain man whose name appeared on page 61 of the ledger for the purchase of an arson in 1868. She watched his face for the half-second it took him to compose it, and she knew. She wrote that afterward, walking home along the levee. She had taken his arm as she always did, and felt the familiar warmth of it through the cotton of his coat sleeve. She understood that the warmth was not a lie, that he did care for her, in whatever degraded sense a man of his kind could care for a woman he had been paid to watch. This knowledge was, in some ways, the worst part. It meant he was not only dangerous, but also, in his own small and compromised way, a man who had come to believe he deserved her. She understood that such a belief made a man behave in ways the cold instruction of his employers could not always anticipate. After that, the plan was simple, though simple is not the right word. On the evening of the 1st of July, after the young planter had left the parlor with his offer of gold and passage, Delphine went directly to the home of the federal marshal, Honoré Henry Callahan, on the far side of the courthouse square. She told him what she had been offered and what she had been threatened with, and asked him for one thing only: to help her disappear in a way that would be more useful than her death. Callahan, an Irishman, a widower, and a man who had spent the war watching the world rearrange itself at a terrible cost, listened to her for nearly an hour. He asked her questions. He asked what she thought would happen to the ledger if she testified. She told him she thought it would vanish from the evidence room within 48 hours of being entered, because the system she had been reading about for 7 nights was older and more patient than Judge Tremont, and colder than any of them had accounted for. He asked what she thought would happen to her if she took the gold and went. She told him she thought the men would let her live for perhaps 2 years, and then, on some winter night in St. Louis or Cincinnati, they would decide the risk of a living witness was too great, and she would die in a way called an accident, and nobody would ever connect it to a parish in Louisiana. He asked what she wanted. She told him she wanted the ledger to survive. She wanted the 17 men to believe they had won. She wanted to live quietly somewhere that was not Louisiana, and she wanted, above all, to leave behind an account that someone, one day, would read. Callahan sat across from her at his small kitchen table for a long time. At last, he said, in the soft and deliberate voice of a man weighing a professional matter, that he thought it could be done. It took him 3 days and most of the private funds he had been saving to move back to Massachusetts after his retirement. Between them, in the 3 days that followed, they arranged for Delphine to be placed on a cotton steamer, bound for Cincinnati on the night of the 4th, traveling under the name of a woman from Natchez, who had died of yellow fever 2 years earlier, and whose papers had been quietly preserved in the marshal's files. They arranged for her supper to be left cold, for her lamp to be burning, for her shoes to be placed beside the bed, and for her door to be locked from the inside by a trick of the bolt that Callahan had learned from a burglar in New York before the war. A method involving a length of fine copper wire and a patient hand that left no evidence of tampering. They arranged, in short, for the room to appear to contain a vanished woman, so that the 17 men of Pointe Coupee would believe they had succeeded and would stop looking. Delphine, at the last, arranged for the ledger to be placed in her aunt's hands in the linen chest, with instructions that it be hidden in the tin trunk in the attic and remain there until the world had become a place where it could be read. But there was one thing more. One thing Hodges published in 1964 that has been largely forgotten since, because it did not fit the clean shape of a tragedy that ended in survival. On the night of the 4th of July, when 3 men entered the boarding house on Rue St. Louis by the back garden with a key given to them by the warehouse clerk Ian Pelletier, and climbed the stairs in their stocking feet to the top floor, and stood in the hallway outside the bolted door, they had expected to find Delphine. They had not expected to find the door already bolted from the inside, with the particular silence of a room that had been arranged. They stood in the hallway for nearly a full minute, listening. One of them knocked softly, 3 times, in a pattern Pelletier had told them Delphine would recognize as his own. They waited. No answer came. They knocked again louder, with the edge of a pistol. No answer came. Then, Hodges wrote, they did the thing agreed upon in advance. They shot the bolt off the door with a single careful pistol. Shot muffled by a leather cushion, entered the room, and found what they found. A supper cold on the table, a lamp still burning, a pair of shoes beside the bed, a Bible open face down on the Book of Judith, and a single sheet of paper on the desk on which the missing woman had written the phrase, "She would not take another name." They stood in that room, the 3 of them, and came, slowly, to the same conclusion Callahan had reached in the morning. A body was not going to be found. A ledger was not going to be found, and something had gone wrong in a way that could not be explained. 2 of them left the house by the back garden. The 3rd stayed behind, because the 3rd was Etienne Pelletier. Pelletier sat down on the chair by the window in the room that still smelled faintly of lavender and of the cooling wick of the oil lamp. He read the sheet of paper on the desk, folded it twice, and put it in his coat pocket. He sat for a long time in the dark. He understood. Before either of the other 2 had understood what had happened. He understood because he had known Delphine better than any of the 17 had allowed themselves to know her. That she had seen through him and through them, and that she had done the one thing none of them had prepared for, vanish in a way that rendered their power meaningless. He understood, sitting there in the dark, that the paper in his pocket, with its 3 initials and 6 words, was addressed to him. She would not take another name. Not his, not any. She had decided who she would be and who she would not be, and the decision had been made before he had ever thought to propose the question. Pelletier left Pointe Coupee the following year. He is recorded in the 1880 census as a bookkeeper in a small cotton warehouse in Mobile, Alabama, unmarried, living in a rented room. He never married. He died in 1897 of tuberculosis in a charity hospital and was buried in a pauper's section of a Catholic cemetery outside the city. The paper with the 3 initials was not among his effects. Whether he burned it, buried it, or carried it to the end and asked for it to be placed in his coffin is not known. Delphine, for her part, lived. She lived in Cincinnati for 6 years, under the name of the dead woman from Natchez, teaching French to the daughters of river merchants. renting a room in a Quaker widow's house, and attending a small Episcopal church on Sunday mornings because she understood that the papers she carried would not stand up to the scrutiny of a Catholic parish with which the dead woman's family had kept up correspondence. She sent money anonymously through the hand of Henry Callahan to Cora Freeman in New Orleans for 11 years. Until Cora moved, and the address was lost. She moved to Boston in 1877, worked briefly for a publishing house as a copy editor of French translations, and then, in 1882, moved to a small town in western Massachusetts, where she taught French at a girls' school for nearly 30 years. She never married. She wore, for the rest of her life, a thin silver chain around her neck that held a small oval locket. When it was opened after her death, by the headmistress of the school, it contained only a folded piece of paper on which 3 initials had been written in a hand that had faded almost to nothing. She never returned to Louisiana. She never spoke of Pointe Coupee. She subscribed, however, to a New Orleans newspaper for 46 years and read it. Her colleagues remembered, in the evenings by the window of the small sitting room she kept at the school, with a pencil in her hand and a cup of chicory coffee beside her. What she marked in those papers, if anything, nobody ever asked. She died in 1928, at the age of 81 of pneumonia following a stroke, and was buried under a name that had never been hers in a New England churchyard, where the headstone gives a date of birth that is not her own. The letter in the tin trunk, addressed to the one who asks, was the last piece of writing she ever signed with her real name. What she had chosen on that night in the parlor was not life and not death, but a third thing to become, in the records of Pointe Coupee, a woman who had vanished while remaining, in the records of her own life, a woman who had lived. She had understood that the ledger would not destroy the system. But she had also understood, with the peculiar and almost weightless clarity of that hour, that the system's greatest weapon against women, like her, was not violence, but erasure, and that the only revenge available to her was to survive and leave a record that would someday be read. Marcus Freeman was not so fortunate. His body was never recovered. The men who took him from the levee path on the night of the 4th of July were never identified in any document that survived the 1884 courthouse fire, though 3 of the 17 names in Robichaux's ledger are known to have purchased, in the weeks afterward, unusually large quantities of lime from a warehouse in Baton Rouge. His widow, Cora, raised their 4 children alone, took in washing for a living, moved to New Orleans in 1878, and lived to see her youngest son become a Pullman porter on the New Orleans to Chicago line. She died in 1902 in a small rented room on Dauphine Street with her daughter at her side. When her daughter was asked, years later, whether her mother had ever spoken of the night her father disappeared, she said her mother had spoken of it exactly once, on the night before she died, and had said only that she hoped somewhere a record still existed, and that somebody, someday, would find it. Edward Lacombe, the shopkeeper, turned up 3 weeks after his disappearance in a jail in Memphis, having been beaten so severely he could no longer speak clearly. He lived the rest of his life in a rooming house run by Methodist missionaries, selling penny candy from a wooden tray to children who passed his window on their way home from the public school. He never testified. He never wrote an account. He died in 1889 of a respiratory illness and was buried in a pauper's grave. The federal judge, Horace Tremont, was transferred to a circuit in Indiana the following year. His attempts to press for a reopening of the Pointe Coupee grand jury were quietly blocked at the department level by superiors who cited the unavailability of witnesses. He retired to Vermont in 1879 and wrote his memoir in the last 5 years of his life, mentioning Pointe Coupee in 2 paragraphs that were later cited by Antoinette Duval at the parish courthouse in 1919 and denied by the parish attorney with a dry, cool hand. The young planter, who had come to the boarding house at dusk with an offer of gold and passage, lived until 1911, became a state senator, endowed a library, and is commemorated by a bronze plaque in the parish courthouse that calls him a man of honor and discretion. His family still lives in Pointe Coupee. The Marshal Henry Callahan, retired in 1874, moved back to Massachusetts and died in 1891 in a small cottage near Lowell, where he is remembered in the local history society as a veteran who spoke rarely of the war and never at all of his years in Louisiana. Among his effects was a locked wooden box containing letters from a woman who signed herself only with a single initial. The box was sold at auction, and the letters have not been seen since. The ledger, published by James Hodges in 1964, sits today in a glass case in the Tulane University archives. The letter sits beside it. The 2 objects together are consulted perhaps 3 times a year, usually by graduate students writing dissertations on Reconstruction era violence, who remark in their footnotes on the curious coincidence of a witness whose disappearance was so thoroughly staged that her body was never found. This mystery shows us something that the word mystery does not quite cover. It shows us that history is not only the record of what was done, but also the record of what was silenced. The people who understood this most clearly were not the historians who came later, but the people who lived it at the time, who stood in darkened parlors and looked across at men who offered them passage in exchange for their testimony, and who understood that the choice being put to them was a choice between being remembered wrongly and being forgotten entirely, and who found, sometimes, a third door that nobody had thought to close. It shows us that a locked room with a cold supper, a burning lamp, and a pair of shoes placed neatly beside a bed is not always a scene of death. Sometimes it is a scene of authorship. Sometimes it is the moment in which a woman who has read 183 pages of a ledger decides what story the parish will tell about her and refuses the one they would have written. It shows us that the most patient man in the room is not always the most dangerous, and that the most dangerous woman in the parish is sometimes the one who has been watched so closely that her watchers have forgotten to notice what she sees. It shows us, finally, that the system that waited in that parlor is not an artifact of a vanished century, because the patience with which it waited, the administrative efficiency with which it disposed of inconvenient people, and the long, slow silence into which it folded its victims are things that a close and careful reader of the present will recognize, if she is honest, as characterizing the country as it stands today. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Delphine chose the only path that could have been chosen? Or do you think there was something she might have done differently? Do you believe Etienne Pelletier, sitting alone in that empty room with a piece of paper in his coat pocket, understood what he had lost? Or do you think men like that never understand what they have lost until long after the losing? Do you think Marcus Freeman's name should be on that plaque in the courthouse instead of the senator's? Leave your answer in the comments below, because I read them, and because these conversations are part of why the channel exists. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who loves the dark corners of American history. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. There are other ledgers in other parishes, and we are only beginning to open them. I will see you in the next video.